Chapter 1. A Garden Party Disrupted. The morning unfolded with the kind of tranquility that had made Little Skelton the epitome of English countryside charm. The sun hung high in a cloudless sky, casting a gentle, golden light over the villages. Cobblestone streets and ivy-clad cottages. The sweet scent of lavender lingered in the air, and the hum of distant bees was the only sound that disturbed the otherwise serene atmosphere. From the small square near the village green to the sprawling gardens of Mrs. Linton's estate, it was a perfect summer's day. Mrs. Linton, an elegant widow with silver hair coiled into an immaculate bun, had prepared for this annual garden party with meticulous care. Her manor house, a sprawling Victorian affair with ivy creeping up its stone walls, was set against a backdrop of perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with color. It was the highlight of the social calendar, drawing everyone from the village's landowners to those with little more than a modest cottage to their name. But as often happens when a place is too perfectly curated, there's always something hiding beneath. Mrs. Linton's impeccable event, the fragrant afternoon tea, the flawlessly set tables, the mingling of neighbors held a subtle, almost imperceptible tension that only Miss Marple could feel. Miss Marple, although a regular guest, was hardly ever the center of attention. At her age, she was in her early 70s, with a sharp mind and a soft, unassuming presence. She was often overlooked, the kind of person people didn't mind being around, yet didn't quite notice. Today, as always, she wore her usual simple dress of floral print, faded with time, and a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders. Her glasses perched delicately on the bridge of her nose, and her white hair, slightly wispy now, framed a face lined with years of observation. She had arrived early before most of the other guests, enjoying the peace and quiet of the garden as the first rays of sunlight kissed the petals of the tulips Mrs. Linton was so proud of. It was a rare moment for Miss Marple, one that allowed her to reflect on the shifting patterns of human behavior. The people she knew, every face in this village, were characters in an ongoing story that had woven itself into the fabric of her life. She was, in essence, a quiet witness to the drama of others. But today, she had a feeling that her role would soon change. The guests began to arrive around noon. There was Alice Wiggins, the local school teacher, who was always just a little too loud for Miss Marple's taste, eager to offer her opinions on everything from the weather to politics. Then there was Arthur Blythe, the village's retired lawyer, whose thick glasses and gruff demeanor often made him seem far older than he was. The younger generation drifted in two young Lydia Harcourt, who had recently returned to the village from London, and the vivacious Clara Hughes, who had a laugh that rang out far too loud despite her apparent shyness. By 3 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Laughter and clinking teacups filled the air, and Mrs. Linton stood in the center, beaming as she played the gracious hostess. The conversation meandered from polite musings about the weather to the latest gossip about the local politics. Yet through it all, Miss Marple remained an observer, content to sip her tea and watch as people interacted, their masks of civility barely concealing their true selves. It was during a particularly boisterous exchange about the town's new postman and upstart from the city, who had yet to win over the older residents, that the first tremor of disruption was felt. A scream split the air. Miss Marple was instantly alert, her sharp gaze flicking towards the source of the sound. She rose from her chair, her movements slow but purposeful. The scream had come from the far end of the garden, near the tulip patch. It was a woman's voice, Clara's, if Miss Marple wasn't mistaken. The guests, momentarily stunned, hesitated before following the sound, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple, however, had already begun walking towards the source, her steps steady and measured. By the time the first few guests reached the garden, Miss Marple was already there, her gaze fixed on the sight before her. The body lay in a crumpled heap, the stark contrast of Harold Pemberton's yellow tie against the green grass a grotesque sight. Harold, the local bank manager, was known for his brash demeanor and his unyielding sense of entitlement. He had a reputation for bullying people into financial decisions that were in his favor, and his rather large estate was rumored to be built on shady dealings. But it was not the man's character that caught Miss Marple's attention, it was the way he lay in the garden. His body was sprawled unnaturally, one leg twisted beneath him in an awkward angle, his arm outstretched as if reaching for something just out of his grasp. And then there was the one tulip that lay beside him, crushed beneath his weight. The petals were bent, discolored as though someone had deliberately pressed it into the dirt. "It's Harold," Alice Wiggins said, her voice trembling. She was standing just a few feet away, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Miss Marple leaned down slightly, her eyes scanning the area. Her gaze shifted from the body to the surroundings, the patch of tulips, the other flowers, and the distant guests who had gathered in a semicircle, murmuring in shock. "The tulips! Did you notice?" she muttered under her breath, her mind already piecing things together in a way that few others could. The flowers, arranged so meticulously, had become part of the puzzle, part of the game she would soon begin. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The news spread quickly throughout the village. By the time the constable arrived with his team of officers, half the town had already gathered at Mrs. Linton's garden gate, craning their necks for a glimpse of the body. It was the first murder in Little Skelton for over a decade, and the villagers, who prided themselves on their quiet lives, were thrown into a frenzy. The constable, a stout man named Reginald Harper, took charge of the scene with a mixture of disbelief and professionalism. He had been with the local force for over 20 years, and while he had dealt with plenty of minor offenses, drunken brawls, petty thefts, the occasional argument between neighbors, he had never encountered a crime so unsettling. He approached the body, kneeling down to inspect it, muttering to himself about the lack of any obvious wounds. "No signs of a struggle," he remarked, but it was clear that this observation only deepened the mystery. How had Harold Pemberton ended up dead in a garden filled with witnesses, with no one noticing anything unusual until it was too late? The villagers stood in clusters, muttering amongst themselves, and it wasn't long before the gossip machine began to hum. The theories flowed fast and furious. Some pointed to Harold's alleged business dealings gone wrong, while others whispered about the relationships he had cultivated or destroyed in the village. "I always said there was something off about him," Lydia Harcourt said to Clara, her voice barely above a whisper. "I bet it's one of those people he swindled." Clara, her eyes still wide from shock, nodded fervently. "Yes, he did have that sort of air about him, didn't he? Too charming for his own good." Miss Marple stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the reactions closely. She took note of their words, their postures, the nervous glances exchanged between a few of the guests. It was all too easy to see the layers of fear, suspicion, and guilt that hung in the air. But Miss Marple wasn't so quick to follow the crowd. She had seen too many mysteries unfold in her time to be swayed by such obvious signs. As the police conducted their initial investigation, Miss Marple quietly moved among the guests, her keen observations never faltering. There was one small detail that she couldn't shake: a small piece of cloth near the tulip patch, half hidden under the grass. It seemed insignificant, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it for a moment longer than anyone else's. She knew, instinctively, that this piece of cloth would soon prove to be more than just a scrap. Miss Marple moved silently through the crowd, her thoughts already forming the first pieces of the puzzle. What had happened in Mrs. Linton's garden that day wasn't just an ordinary crime. It was a moment that would unravel the very secrets hidden within the village, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them all. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The sun, which had once shone with a golden brilliance over Mrs. Linton's garden, now seemed harsh, its heat a distant discomfort against the deep unease that gripped Little Skelton. The air felt thick, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. The small crowd of onlookers had gathered in a semicircle, their voices a low murmur as they shared what little they knew, their eyes darting toward the body of Harold Pemberton. The sight of the corpse sprawled awkwardly on the grass was a jarring intrusion into the otherwise serene setting. Despite the constable's orders to keep the area clear, the village had already begun to fracture into small, gossiping groups. The older generation clucked their tongues and exchanged glances laden with unspoken history. while the younger crowd, those who had never before witnessed the terror of violence in their own village, stood stiffly, trying to hide their shock behind forced composure. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart from the others, noted each individual's reaction. Some of the women were clutching their handbags tightly to their chests, as though the delicate leather could shield them from the horror of the situation. Others, like Arthur Blythe, the retired lawyer, seemed unusually calm, almost too composed. He stood at the edge of the group, hands clasped behind his back, his expression hard to read. Miss Marple, though, had always been a keen judge of character. His unease was barely concealed, like a tremor beneath the surface. "Have you seen it?" Alice Wiggins, the schoolteacher, asked in a high, anxious voice. She had moved closer to the group, her words barely audible above the hum of murmurs. "Seen what?" Clara Hughes replied, her face still pale, though her voice had regained some steadiness. "The tulips," Alice said, eyes wide with an almost childlike dread. "The one near the body, it's as though it was crushed under him." Miss Marple, who had been silently observing the guests, found herself drawn to Alice's words. The tulip in question, the one lying beside the body, had indeed been crushed. Its petals twisted, but it was not just the physical destruction. That caught Miss Marple's attention. There was something about it, something unsettling about the way it had fallen, as though it had been positioned just so. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, and Miss Marple, with the quiet decisiveness that had come with years of experience, moved toward the center of the gathering. It was as if the village had adopted a sort of unspoken ritual. In these moments of crisis, everyone had a role to play. The constable, with his ruddy face, was too busy directing the officers to pay any mind to the idle chatter of the villagers. But Miss Marple knew that the answers lay not in the confusion of the moment, but in the small details that others might overlook. She approached Mrs. Linton, who had taken up a seat on the stone bench by the garden's edge, her face a picture of distress. The elderly widow had never been one for public displays of emotion, but today, her usual poise seemed to have slipped, and she appeared on the verge of tears. "It's all too much, Miss Marple," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I just don't understand it. Harold, he wasn't a saint, but murder." Miss Marple sat down beside her, maintaining the quiet reserve that had served her so well over the years. "Murder often strikes where we least expect it," she said softly, her gaze resting on the cluster of tulips. "But not all is as it seems." Mrs. Linton, not fully understanding, turned her tear-filled eyes to Miss Marple. "What do you mean?" "The tulip," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, "it didn't turn." Mrs. Linton blinked, clearly not understanding the significance of the observation. Miss Marple, however, had already turned her attention back to the garden, her thoughts swirling. The arrangement of flowers in Mrs. Linton's garden had always been a source of pride, particularly the tulips. It was said that each one was planted to catch the sunlight at a specific time of day, and yet here was one that had failed to do so. It had bent unnaturally, its petals crushed, its very position against Harold's body suggesting it had been manipulated, deliberately disturbed. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," Mrs. Linton said, wiping her eyes, "but I just can't see it." "That's the thing, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm. "You're not supposed to see it, but it's there." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Harper, who, despite his best efforts to maintain a professional demeanor, was visibly rattled. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and cast a glance at the crowd. It was clear that his thoughts were still racing, struggling to make sense of the murder. "The body's been moved," he said, glancing at the group. "We'll need to get everyone inside." "There's no need for more gossip." Miss Marple stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Quite right," she said, though her eyes lingered on the scene. The constable's statement wasn't entirely true. The body had not been moved. It had merely been inspected briefly by the officers. But the idea of the scene being disturbed unnerved Miss Marple. She would need to speak to him later, once the initial investigation had settled. As the villagers reluctantly made their way inside Mrs. Linton's house for a temporary respite, Miss Marple remained outside for a few more moments. The air had thickened and the gentle breeze had stilled. Everything felt suspended, as though time had stopped at that moment. She knelt down beside the patch of tulips, her fingers brushing gently over the petals. They were soft, fragile, and yet they had been crushed with such force that it was hard to believe the body had simply fallen onto them. Miss Marple's thoughts whirled. There had to be more to this. Someone had placed Harold Pemberton's body in this position for a reason. But who and why? The garden, once a sanctuary of blooms and serenity, had become a stage for something darker. Harold's death was no accident, and Miss Marple knew it. But the question lingered: who stood to gain from his demise? And was the answer really as simple as the town's gossip suggested? Inside, the guests were gathered in the drawing room, each of them simmering with speculation. Arthur Blythe, leaning against the mantel, was murmuring to Mrs. Wiggins, though Miss Marple couldn't quite catch the words. Lydia Harcourt, who had been standing near the door, caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled hesitantly. Miss Marple returned the smile with a faint nod but did not join the group. She had never been one for the idle chit-chat that often followed such traumatic events. There would be time for that later, once the true nature of the crime began to reveal itself. But for now, she needed to observe, to take in every subtle movement and every word spoken. There was more here than met the eye. As she moved further into the room, her eyes caught the nervous energy of Clara Hughes, who had taken a seat by the window, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. Miss Marple had always been astute in reading people, and Clara's behavior now was unmistakable. She was hiding something important. For a moment, Miss Marple wondered whether the girl knew more than she let on. But there was no need to rush. Nothing in the puzzle was quite ready to fit, yet Constable Harper had begun questioning the guests individually, his calm voice interrupting the whispers of the crowd. Miss Marple, standing by the fireplace, continued to observe. As the villagers gave their statements, she allowed herself to settle into the rhythm of the investigation. What had been a pleasant afternoon at Mrs. Linton's house was now something else entirely, a tangled web of lies, half-truths, and forgotten secrets. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, its measured pace marking the passage of time. And as Miss Marple watched the interactions between the villagers, she knew this was only the beginning. Something had shifted in Little Skelton that afternoon, and the truth, as it always did, would slowly begin to unravel. Chapter 3. Early investigation. The following days after Harold Pemberton's death were filled with an oppressive stillness, as if the entire village had held its breath and was unwilling to exhale. Little Skelton, the town where the most exciting news usually revolved around the weather or the arrival of a new batch of knitting patterns at the local shop, was now rife with whispers, speculation, and mistrust. What had once been a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's business was now a place of tension and suspicion. Miss Marple had spent the morning in quiet reflection, sitting by her small kitchen window overlooking her garden. The peacefulness of the countryside, with its birdsong and rustling trees, seemed almost a mockery of the storm brewing just outside the village's borders. In truth, Miss Marple had never been fond of such peacefulness. It often concealed far more than it revealed. It was the way people hid behind their masks of civility that fascinated her. Beneath the surface, everyone had something to hide, whether they knew it or not. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Linton's house. The widow had requested her presence, and Miss Marple's intuition told her it was important. There had been something in Mrs. Linton's voice when they last spoke, a quiet desperation that no amount of gracious hosting could disguise. The widow, it seemed, was struggling to maintain control of both her emotions and her household. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by Mrs. Linton's housekeeper, Mrs. Bradshaw, who had been with the family for years. Mrs. Bradshaw was an aging woman, her once dark hair now streaked with gray, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Miss Marple, I believe Mrs. Linton is expecting you," she said in her usual brisk manner, leading Miss Marple into the drawing room where Mrs. Linton sat, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her usual composure shattered. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Linton greeted, her voice wavering slightly. She attempted a smile, but it was weak, lacking the usual warmth. "Thank you for coming. I don't know who else to turn to. It's all so overwhelming. Everyone has their theories about Harold's death, but none of them seem to make sense." Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Linton, allowing her time to gather herself. "Sometimes, my dear," she said, her voice soft and gentle, "it takes a little time for the truth to reveal itself. But we must be patient." "I know," Mrs. Linton replied, nodding. "But this isn't just about Harold's death. It's about everything, all the secrets he kept, the things people have said about him. People have no idea what he was really like, Miss Marple. And now they're all asking questions. Questions are to be expected when someone dies under mysterious circumstances. Miss Marple observed, "It's only natural, but it's also important to remember that not everything people say is true. Theories are often colored by personal biases or grudges. We must sift through them carefully." Mrs. Linton looked at Miss Marple, her eyes desperate for some semblance of reassurance. What if they're right? What if Harold's death isn't as random as we thought? What if he was involved in something far more sinister? Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering the weight of Mrs. Linton's words. "Tell me, Mrs. Linton," she began slowly, "what exactly was Harold involved in? I've heard whispers, nothing concrete, of course, but it's clear that many in this town had their issues with him." Mrs. Linton hesitated. She glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to overhear them. "Harold was a man of many contradictions. He could be charming, yes, but he was also ruthless in business. He often took advantage of people. I don't know if he meant to be cruel. Perhaps he was just blind to the consequences of his actions. But there were many who felt wronged by him, and now it seems that someone's exacting revenge." Miss Marple nodded, taking in every word. "And did Harold have any enemies? Anyone who might have had the motive to harm him?" Mrs. Linton's eyes darkened. "There were a few, yes. People who lost money in his dealings, but he never seemed afraid. I don't think he ever saw himself as vulnerable. Perhaps that was his downfall? And did he have any family connections? Anyone who might stand to gain from his death?" At the mention of family, Mrs. Linton's expression faltered. Harold was never close to his family. His parents passed away when he was young, and he had no siblings. He was a solitary man in many ways. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the armrest thoughtfully. The conversation had offered more questions than answers, but it was a start. Something about Mrs. Linton's unease struck a chord with Miss Marple. She could feel the subtle layers of deception that lay just beneath the widow's composed exterior. Harold Pemberton may have been a man of secrets, but Mrs. Linton was hiding something as well. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "it would help if you could tell me more about Harold's personal life. His relationships with others, his friends, anyone he spent time with outside of the business world. You mentioned that he was charming. Who did he charm, and who did he alienate?" Mrs. Linton's eyes flickered with a mix of reluctance and guilt. She pressed her lips together, clearly struggling with the decision to speak further. Finally, she sighed deeply. There was one person, one who might know more than anyone else, but I'm not sure if it's wise to involve him. You see, Miss Marple, Harold had an affair with a woman in town, a woman who was far younger than him, and quite beautiful. Her name was Lydia Harcourt. Miss Marple's brow furrowed at the mention of Lydia Harcourt. She had observed the young woman at the garden party, standing near the door, casting anxious glances about. Lydia had been a bit too eager to join in on the gossip, her laugh too loud and her gestures too exaggerated. Miss Marple had taken note of her behavior, but until now she hadn't connected her to Harold. "And how did this affair affect the relationship between Lydia and Harold?" Miss Marple asked, her tone calm but probing. "Lydia was infatuated with Harold, I think. She was the one who became enamored with him first, and he wasn't the kind of man to turn down attention. But eventually he grew tired of her, as he did with many people. He was always seeking something new, something more exciting. But Lydia didn't take it well. I'm afraid she became obsessed." "Obsessed?" Miss Marple repeated her. Interest piqued. And how did she react to his rejection? Mrs. Linton's face tightened. Lydia grew bitter. There were rumors that she tried to confront Harold, to force him to make some kind of commitment, but he refused. I believe she still held on to some hope, but after his death, I don't know. I haven't seen her in days. No one has. Miss Marple's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but there was still much left unsaid. Mrs. Linton's hesitations, her troubled silence at certain moments, all pointed toward something she had yet to reveal. But what? I will look into this further, Mrs. Linton, Miss Marple said, standing up from her seat. In the meantime, I suggest you keep an eye on those who might know more about Harold's dealings, his associates, his friends, anyone he might have confided in. Mrs. Linton nodded gratefully, though there was still a cloud of uncertainty hanging over her. As Miss Marple made her way toward the door, she paused. Just one more thing, Mrs. Linton, she added, turning slightly. Was there anything unusual about Harold's behavior in the days leading up to his death? Any sign that he knew something was wrong? Mrs. Linton hesitated before answering. He was different, more anxious perhaps. He started locking himself in his office more often. He said he had business matters to attend to, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. I see, Miss Marple said, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Mrs. Linton. I will speak with Lydia Harcourt next. There is something there, I am sure of it. As Miss Marple left the room, she felt the weight of the case settling more firmly on her shoulders. There was much to uncover in Little Skelton, and Miss Marple knew that the answers were hidden beneath layers of pride, deceit, and broken hearts. But she was patient, and she would get to the truth no matter how long it took. The village had changed since Harold Pemberton's death. And now, Miss Marple's quiet investigation would begin to unearth secrets no one had dared to speak aloud. Chapter 4. First suspects. As the days passed, the air in Little Skelton grew thick with suspicion. Every glance between neighbors, every exchange in the village square carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. What had once been a quiet, picturesque village was now something darker. Conversations that had once been light and full of trivial matters now circled around one pressing question: who had killed Harold Pemberton? Miss Marple, ever the observer, had seen how people's behavior shifted after the murder. Faces once familiar had become more guarded, voices quieter, and eyes more calculating. It was always like this after a crime, people trying to make sense of the senseless, assigning blame to those they didn't fully understand or to those they had long been suspicious of. It was a dangerous game, one that Miss Marple had played. In her own quiet way, but it was one that she played with patience, never rushing to conclusions. Her first task had been to learn more about the individuals closest to Harold, especially those who had once been a part of his inner circle. His personal relationships were key, and she knew that uncovering the layers of those connections would provide the foundation for the truth. The most obvious first step was Lydia Harcourt. The young woman had once been Harold's lover, but it appeared that her infatuation with him had turned into something darker. When Miss Marple arrived at the Harcourt residence, she was greeted by the maid, who had an air of reluctance about her, as though she knew that something had gone terribly wrong but didn't know how to address it. Miss Harcourt is expecting you, the maid said quietly, her eyes downcast. But I must warn you, she isn't in the best of spirits today. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm. I understand. I'll speak with her now. Lydia Harcourt sat by the window of the sitting room, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She had the look of someone who had just emerged from a storm, disheveled but trying to regain composure. There was a tightness to her posture that suggested more than just sadness. There was guilt, hidden beneath layers of grief. Miss Harcourt, Miss Marple began, her voice soft as she stepped into the room. I hope you are well. I know. These past few days must have been difficult. Lydia looked up, her eyes brimming with emotion. But there was also a flicker of something else, something calculating behind her gaze. She stood, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured for Miss Marple to sit. I didn't expect you, Lydia said, her voice strained. Everyone seems to be asking questions about Harold, but I'm not sure I can answer them. I don't know what happened that day. All I know is that I loved him. I wanted to make him see me. But I never thought something like this would happen. Miss Marple sat down across from her, her eyes never leaving Lydia's face. There was a certain desperation in her tone, but also something else, something that didn't quite add up. The young woman's words rang with the sincerity of someone who was both grieving and trying to distance herself from responsibility. "You say you loved him," Miss Marple said slowly. "But Harold was a complicated man. He wasn't always easy to love. Did he speak to you about his troubles?" Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze falling to the floor. For a long moment, she was silent. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, knowing that it would eventually force Lydia to speak. Lydia began, then stopped, herself, a sudden flush rising to her cheeks. "I don't know what you're implying. He was difficult, yes. He could be cruel sometimes, but he was also charming. He had a way of making people feel important, like they mattered. That's why I stayed. I thought he would eventually choose me. But then he started pulling away. He stopped answering. My letters, he wouldn't see me. He said he was busy with work. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And how did you feel when he ended things? Did you accept it quietly?" Lydia's face twisted in a mixture of frustration and pain. "No, of course not. I tried to talk to him too. Make him understand, but he wouldn't listen. I begged him to see me and he just brushed me off. That was the last time we spoke before he died." Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the tightness in Lydia's throat, the way her hands twisted together as she spoke. There was a vulnerability in her words, but there was also an undercurrent of something else, resentment, perhaps, or the sting of unrequited love that had turned into something darker. "You must have been angry," Miss Marple said softly. "After all, you had invested so much of yourself in him." Lydia's eyes darted toward Miss Marple, a flash of something sharp passing through them. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "I was angry," Lydia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to choose me." Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "You say you tried to speak with him? Did you ever speak to anyone about your relationship with Harold? To anyone who might have known about it?" Lydia hesitated for a long moment, her eyes shifting away from Miss Marple's gaze. "I didn't speak to anyone about it. Not really. But I know people were talking. There were whispers about our affair. And then, after Harold started ignoring me, the whispers grew louder. I think some people were happy he had moved on. They didn't think I was good enough for him." "Who were these people?" Miss Marple asked, her voice sharp now. Lydia's face flushed again, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know, people in the village. I think they all knew what was going on. And when he died, She stopped herself, swallowing hard. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind piecing together the information. Lydia Harcourt was upset, yes, but there was more to this young woman's emotions than just grief. She had been deeply wounded by Harold's rejection, and there was something about her reaction to his death that seemed almost too self-centered. It was as though her grief wasn't just for him. It was for herself, for the opportunity that had slipped through her fingers. Before Miss Marple could speak further, Lydia's maid entered the room, interrupting the conversation. "Miss Harcourt," the maid said quietly, "there's someone here to see you. It's Mr. Blythe." Lydia's face stiffened at the mention of Arthur Blythe, the retired lawyer. She glanced at Miss Marple, her expression unreadable. "I suppose I must speak with him," Lydia said, her voice colder now. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. I'll think on what you've said." Miss Marple stood, offering Lydia a soft smile. "Thank you for your time, Miss Harcourt. I'll be in touch." As Miss Marple left the room, her thoughts turned to Arthur Blythe. The man had been standing at the periphery of the investigation. A silent observer, but something about his quiet demeanor seemed too controlled, too calculated. He had been a trusted figure in the village, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that trust was often the very thing that hid the deepest secrets. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Blythe residence, a small but imposing stone cottage at the edge of the village. It was a home that seemed to exude authority, the kind of place that suggested both wealth and a long-standing presence in the community. Arthur Blythe was known for his reticent nature, his sharp mind, and his ability to manipulate legal matters to his advantage. But there was always something unsettling about him, an air of superiority that made him seem above the common concerns of the villagers. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by the housekeeper, who seemed less than pleased to see her. "Mr. Blythe isn't expecting you, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said stiffly, but Miss Marple could see the hesitation in the woman's eyes. "Please inform him that I'm here," Miss Marple replied politely but with the firm conviction that left no room for argument. As the housekeeper disappeared, Miss Marple turned her attention to the garden, taking in the well-kept shrubs and flower beds. It was the kind of place where everything was in its place, but there was no warmth, no welcoming feel. It was all business, all formality, a perfect setting for a man like Arthur Blythe. Moments later, the housekeeper returned and led Miss Marple into the study, where Blythe sat behind an ornate desk, his sharp eyes studying her as she entered. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice deep and even. "What brings you here today?" Miss Marple studied him closely, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I have some questions, Mr. Blythe, about Harold Pemberton." Arthur Blythe didn't flinch, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. "Of course," he said, his tone measured. "What would you like to know?" "I'd like to know what you know about his business dealings and whether you were aware of any tensions he had with anyone in the village." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on his face, her words deliberate. Blythe hesitated, then sighed, clearly calculating his response. "Tensions are a part of life, Miss Marple. Harold was a man of ambition. He wasn't always well liked, but that's no reason to suspect foul play." Miss Marple didn't respond, immediately letting the silence stretch between them. She knew he was holding something back. He was too careful in his answers, too smooth in his delivery. "We'll see about that," she said softly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. The game had only just begun. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue: The Quiet. Measured pace of Miss Marple's investigation had become almost routine by now, but beneath the surface, a tension was building. As the days passed, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, but there were still too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in the story that refused to align. Harold Pemberton's death had shaken Little Skelton to its core, but Miss Marple knew that the key to understanding the crime wasn't in the loud, obvious accusations, but in the small, nearly invisible details. And there was one detail that had been nagging at her ever since her visit to Lydia Harcourt's home. The maid's unexpected appearance during her conversation with Lydia had been a curious interruption. It had been brief, but Miss Marple had noticed something that others might have overlooked. As Lydia's expression shifted from one of desperation to one of guarded coldness, Miss Marple had seen it. A fleeting glance at the maid, a momentary hesitation. Lydia had been caught off guard, but it wasn't the maid's arrival that unsettled her. It was what had been left unsaid, the weight of a secret that lingered between them. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned to her small cottage, a place of solace and reflection after a long day. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at the garden, where the tulips had begun to wither as the season progressed. The flowers that had once been vibrant now seemed to echo the quiet unease that had settled over Little Skelton. She couldn't help but think back to the garden party, to the moment when the body had been discovered near the tulips. The image of Harold Pemberton sprawled on the ground, with that crushed tulip beside him, had stayed with her, gnawing at her thoughts. As the sunlight began to fade, she rose and walked to the small desk in the corner of her room, where a collection of notes and scribbled observations were scattered. The details from her visits to Lydia and Arthur Blythe filled the pages, and yet she couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. Each conversation had led her to more questions rather than answers, but there was one thing she couldn't shake: the small clues she had spotted during her visit to Lydia's house. There was something off about the maid's timing. It wasn't just her interruption that bothered Miss Marple. It was the way Lydia had reacted to her arrival. Miss Marple was sure that Lydia knew more than she was letting on, and the maid's presence was no coincidence. Perhaps she had seen something or overheard something that could provide the missing link. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to pay the maid a visit. Her mind was set. She couldn't allow the matter to rest. The maid, a quiet and unassuming young woman by the name of Miss Green, was not someone who seemed likely to attract attention. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most unremarkable individuals often held the key to the deepest mysteries. Miss Marple arrived at the Harcourt residence just as the morning fog began to lift, revealing the sleepy streets of Little Skelton. The housekeeper greeted her at the door, a polite but distant smile on her face. "Miss Green is in the garden, Miss Marple," she said, her voice laced with a faint trace of nervousness. "I'll let her know you've arrived." The garden, unlike Mrs. Linton's carefully curated estate, was more wild, more unkempt. The flowers were abundant but untended, the hedges overgrown and disheveled. It was a place of quiet reflection, where time seemed to slow as though the world outside the gates didn't exist. And yet, in the midst of this stillness, Miss Green sat on a bench near the farthest corner, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze distant and unfocused. Miss Marple approached her slowly, giving the young woman time to acknowledge her presence. Miss Green looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. There was something about her that made Miss Marple pause, an innocence that felt forced, as though it were a mask, carefully crafted to shield her from the world. "Miss Green," Miss Marple said softly, sitting beside her on the bench. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I simply wanted to ask you a few questions about the events surrounding Mr. Pemberton's death. I believe you may have seen something that could help." The maid stiffened at the mention of Harold's name, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Miss Marple noticed how her shoulders tensed, how her eyes darted away, as though she were trying to avoid the question. But Miss Marple was patient. She didn't rush, didn't press. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch between them. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," Miss Green said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know anything about Mr. Pemberton's death. I just do my work and try to keep to myself." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the unease in her voice, the way her gaze flickered toward the house, as if seeking refuge in the security of its walls. There was a lie hidden in her words, Miss Marple was certain of it. She had seen it 1,000 times before, people who tried to hide the truth, not out of malice, but out of fear. "I understand," Miss Marple said softly. "But I believe you know more than you're letting on, Miss Green. You were in the house the day Mr. Pemberton died. You were there when Miss Harcourt and I were speaking, weren't you?" The maid flinched at the mention of Lydia's name, her eyes widening. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a crack in her composure. I didn't mean to overhear anything," Miss Green said hurriedly, her voice shaking. "I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just passing by and Miss Green," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "you don't need to explain yourself. I simply want to understand what happened. I believe you saw something important, something that could help me solve this mystery." The maid was silent for a long moment, her eyes cast down at her hands. Miss Marple could see the internal struggle within her. She wanted to speak, but something held her back. Miss Marple waited patiently, her gaze soft, giving Miss Green the space she needed. Finally, with a deep breath, Miss Green spoke. "I didn't mean to get involved, but I did overhear something. Miss Harcourt, she was upset when she spoke to Mr. Pemberton. She kept saying she couldn't live without him. I didn't hear everything, but it was clear she was desperate. And she said something about a plan. She said that if he wouldn't be with her, then no one would have him." Miss Marple's heart quickened. It was a small detail, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Lydia Harcourt's obsession with Harold had crossed a dangerous line, one that could have led her to something far more sinister. The maid's words confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along. The affair had not ended quietly, and the consequences had been far more dire than anyone had imagined. "And what else did you hear, Miss Green?" Miss Marple asked. Gently, the maid shook her head, her face pale with fear. "That's all. I didn't hear anything else. But when I saw Miss Harcourt leaving the house that day, she looked different. She was angry, and she was crying. I don't know what happened, but I thought it was important." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. "Thank you, Miss Green. You've been very helpful." As Miss Marple rose to leave, she gave the maid one last look. There was a flicker of guilt in Miss Green's eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that she had known more than she had let on. But the maid was not the murderer. She was simply a witness, caught in the web of events that had spiraled out of control. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her thoughts swirling. Lydia Harcourt's obsession with Harold had now taken on a darker, more dangerous tone. But there was still much to uncover. The story was far from over, and Miss Marple knew that the final pieces of the puzzle would soon be revealed. But there was something else, something nagging at the back of her mind. The maid had mentioned a plan that had been set in motion. What did that mean? And who else had been involved? The answers, Miss Marple knew, were just out of reach. But they were getting closer, one small clue at a time. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The afternoon was beginning to fade when Miss Marple arrived at the small, humble cottage on the edge of Little Skelton. It was tucked away behind a hedge of ivy, the kind of place that could easily be overlooked if one weren't looking for it. The quiet, unassuming nature of the house suited its occupant, a man whose name had surfaced more than once during Miss Marple's investigation, Simon Everley. Simon Everley was a mystery in himself. He had arrived in Little Skelton several years ago, a young man in his mid-30s with a quiet demeanor that belied his sharp intellect. He had been seen at various social functions, though always at the edge of the group, never quite fully participating. He had struck Miss Marple as someone who preferred to observe rather than engage, and that alone made him interesting. What was even more intriguing was his connection to Harold Pemberton, whose name had been spoken with such veiled hostility by the villagers. It was said that Simon and Harold had been close friends, once business partners even, but something had gone wrong, and now there was an uncomfortable distance between them. That distance, Miss Marple suspected, was more than just personal. It was possible that the two men had shared more than just a few business deals. There had been whispers about hidden debts, financial troubles, and disagreements that had turned their once friendship into something much more contentious. Miss Marple stood at the doorstep of the cottage, her hand resting lightly on the brass knocker. There was no answer at first, but she wasn't in a hurry. Simon Everley was the sort of person who didn't rush into things, who took his time to consider every move. Miss Marple had learned to be patient in her line of work, knowing that rushing into a confrontation often led to more confusion than clarity. When the door finally opened, it was not Simon who greeted her, but a tall, wiry man with unkempt hair and a look of surprise on his face. His eyes darted nervously over Miss Marple before he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "Simon is in the back," the man said curtly, his voice strained. "I'll let him know you're here." "Thank you," Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady as she stepped inside. The cottage was small, its wooden beams low, and its rooms crammed with mismatched furniture. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the space with warmth, but there was an underlying coldness to the atmosphere, as though the house itself had secrets it didn't wish to reveal. Miss Marple took a moment to observe her surroundings, noting the scattered papers on a desk in the corner, the half-filled cup of tea on a table beside a well-worn chair. There was an unfinished quality to everything in the room, as though Simon Everley was a man who had left much undone. The sound of footsteps approached, and Simon Everley appeared in the doorway. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his shirt rumpled as though he had been lost in thought for hours. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression flickered with something, a mixture of surprise and wariness, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "I wasn't expecting you, but I'm happy to see you. I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long." "Not at all, Mr. Everley," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but steady. I trust I'm not interrupting anything important? No, not at all, Simon said quickly. He motioned for her to sit. Please do make yourself comfortable. Can I offer you something to drink? Tea, perhaps? No, thank you, Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair across from him. She studied him carefully, noting the way he hesitated before sitting down, as though uncertain about the direction their conversation might take. I've come to speak with you about Mr. Pemberton, she said, her voice soft but direct. At the mention of Harold's name, Simon's expression shifted ever so slightly. He remained composed, but Miss Marple caught the subtle tightening of his jaw, the brief flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Harold Pemberton, Simon repeated, his voice neutral. I wasn't aware that you were investigating his death, Miss Marple. But then, I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone began asking questions. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on him. I've spoken to a number of people about Harold, and I've heard your name mentioned. Several times. You and he were close once, weren't you? Simon's eyes flickered again, but he remained composed. Yes, we were, he admitted after a moment. We were business partners once. I suppose it's only natural that people would talk about our relationship. And yet, it seems that the relationship soured, Miss Marple pressed gently. What happened, Mr. Everly? Why did it end? Simon's hands clenched momentarily, though his face remained impassive. I'm not sure that's anyone's business but mine, he said, his voice low. Harold and I had our differences, certainly, but I'm afraid I'm not in the mood for discussing old grievances. Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. I understand, Mr. Everly, but it's not just the past that concerns me, it's the present. You see, there are many questions about Harold's death, and I have reason to believe that you may know something about it. Simon stiffened, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Miss Marple. For a long moment, he remained silent, his expression weighing her carefully. Then with the faintest of nods, he spoke. What exactly is it you want to know, Miss Marple? Miss Marple paused before answering. I've spoken with several who knew Harold, his colleagues, his acquaintances. There were conflicts, yes, but none offered a reason someone would go so far as to kill him. But I think you might hold a clearer insight. You were among the last to see him alive, weren't you? Simon didn't answer at once. His gaze drifted toward the window, eyes following the distant horizon as though searching for something hidden in the fog. Miss Marple studied him closely, recognizing the familiar act someone buying time, steadying themselves before speaking. But she was patient. She had seen it countless times before, the polished walls people erected to guard the truth. I did see Harold, Simon said at last, his voice softer, more deliberate. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Everly, Miss Marple replied evenly. I only want to understand what happened. Harold Pemberton was no stranger to enemies, but I don't believe his death was senseless. It was deliberate. Someone had a reason, did you? Simon turned back toward her, his eyes narrowing as though dissecting her every word. I had my quarrels with Harold, but no, I didn't kill him. If that's your question. Miss Marple inclined her head, her gaze thoughtful. I don't believe you did. But I do believe you know more than you're admitting. Harold kept secrets, Mr. Everly, and I suspect one of those secrets ties directly to what he was involved in before his death. Something he wished to keep buried? Simon's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with something Miss Marple couldn't quite decipher. You think I'm concealing something? He asked, his tone sharp. I think you're protecting someone, Miss Marple said gently, her voice steady. Someone who didn't want their dealings with Harold exposed. You've been keeping back the truth, Mr. Everly, I'm certain of it. For a time, Simon said nothing. His gaze locked on hers, tension weighing the silence between them. Whether he was shielding another or simply covering himself from consequence, Miss Marple couldn't yet be sure. But one thing was clear, Simon. Everly knew more than he was saying. I'm not sure what you mean to suggest, Miss Marple, Simon said at last, his tone cool and clipped. But I've told you all I know. Harold's death was tragic, yes, but it isn't something I can explain. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes never leaving him. I'll leave you to your thoughts, Mr. Everly, but take care. The truth has a habit of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's concealed. As she walked toward the door, she couldn't shake the sense that Simon Everly's words, his cold refusal, were not the whole truth, but just another layer of the web surrounding Harold's death. She had long since learned that truth rarely shouted. It lingered in the silences, in the hesitations. And Simon's hesitation had spoken louder than he knew. The case was far from closed. In fact, Miss Marple was certain the most vital pieces of the puzzle were still waiting to emerge. Chapter 7. Another. Twist the days and Little Skelton had grown colder as autumn crept in. The gardens that had once blazed with color now lay muted beneath the gray skies. Each evening, a heavy fog rolled in, cloaking the streets in shadow, sending the villagers quietly back into their homes. Miss Marple felt the shift in the air. The murder of Harold Pemberton had unsettled everything. Where there had once been easy chatter, conversations now carried an edge of suspicion. No one could avoid the question, who had killed Harold and why? The village had become a place where old stories were unearthed and secrets once neatly locked away began to surface. The investigation had carried Miss Marple down many winding paths. She had spoken with numerous villagers, each conversation revealing more about Harold's stormy dealings, his fractured ties, and the tangle of emotions he left behind. Yet the picture was still incomplete. Too many gaps remained, too many pieces resisted fitting together. The most pressing of these, Miss Marple knew, concerned the missing link between Lydia Harcourt and Simon Everly. Both had played significant roles in Harold's life, yet their accounts diverged in odd, troubling ways. Something connected them, something they were both hiding. But each time she pressed, their replies grew guarded, their defenses tight. A few days after her tense exchange with Simon Everly, Miss Marple once again walked through Little Skelton's fog-shrouded streets. This time, her destination was the local inn, a place where villagers gathered to drink, gossip, and share whispers of the latest news. If there was anywhere to feel the village's pulse, it was here, amid the warmth of the fire and the clink of glasses. Miss Marple had visited the inn before, but today her purpose was more deliberate. She had caught wind of a rumor, something that rang false, and she meant to look into it. Inside, the inn hummed with life, though an undercurrent of unease ran through the room. Conversation faltered as Miss Marple entered, a ripple of awareness passing quickly among the patrons. Most were lifelong residents of Little Skelton, and they turned their eyes to her before lowering their voices again. Miss Marple slipped into a small corner table, her gaze quietly sweeping the room. The innkeeper, a stout, ruddy-faced man, bustled over with a genial smile. "Miss Marple? Been some time. What'll it be today?" "Just tea, thank you," she replied, her eyes drifting toward the group gathered at the bar. Among them stood Arthur Blave, his shoulders stiff, his expression guarded. He leaned close to two men, speaking in a hushed tone that carried the weight of unease. As the innkeeper said about her tea, Miss Marple kept her attention on Blave. She had always found him puzzling, an outsider who nonetheless seemed woven into every conversation. Once a lawyer, his manner still carried that air of authority, but it was the way he hovered at the edge of things, never fully part of them, that intrigued her most. Then the door opened and Lydia Harcourt stepped inside. She was alone, her usual vitality dimmed by sorrow. Her appearance was disheveled, her eyes rimmed red as though from nights of weeping. She looked worn, her confidence stripped away, leaving only fragile despair. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Lydia's presence here was no coincidence. She had come to meet someone, perhaps for comfort, or perhaps to speak with those men already, whispering by the bar. Miss Marple suspected Lydia's secrets were far from spent. The innkeeper returned with her tea, but Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on Lydia, who now approached Arthur Blythe. Their words were quiet, but the shift in body language was unmistakable. Lydia's urgent gestures, Blythe's cool detachment. This was no casual exchange, it was a confrontation. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple moved closer, just enough to catch fragments of their conversation. I told you, it's not that simple. Blythe's voice was firm, threaded with frustration. You can't just walk in here and expect it all to be resolved. You know what happened? Lydia's reply came in a trembling whisper. You promised me. You said everything would be fine. Now they're asking questions. Harold's gone, Arthur. They'll uncover everything, and I can't bear the pressure. I can't keep lying. Miss Marple, now standing just behind them, felt the tension crackle in the air. Lydia was shaking, clutching the bar for support. Arthur Blythe, for all his composure, looked unsettled, his eyes darting as though fearful of being overheard. I did what I had to do, he muttered, his tone low, defensive. And you'll do what you must. You've got no choice now. Lydia's face twisted in anguish. I can't go on like this. The whole village is going to turn on me. And you're not helping. You're just making it worse. There it was, the admission, however reluctant. Lydia Harcourt had been involved somehow in the events leading up to Harold's death. The details were still unclear, but it was becoming evident that her connection to Simon Everleigh and now to Arthur Blythe was deeper than Miss Marple had first imagined. It was no longer just about a broken affair or a desperate woman. There were consequences to Harold's death, consequences that Lydia was not ready to face. Miss Marple took a step back, choosing not to reveal her presence just yet. It wasn't her place to interrupt their conversation. Instead, she absorbed every word, every shift in their voices, knowing that this moment would be crucial in the unfolding mystery. As she turned to leave the inn, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The threads connecting Simon Everleigh, Arthur Blythe, and Lydia Harcourt were more tangled than she had first suspected. The young woman's desperation had led her down a dangerous path, and now it was clear that others were involved, willing or not. Miss Marple had no illusions about the difficulty of the path ahead. It was one thing to uncover the secrets of a small village, but it was quite another to separate the truth from the lies. Every person she spoke to seemed to have their own version of events, their own reasons for protecting or betraying each other. But one thing was certain, Miss Marple was getting closer to the heart of the matter. Harold Pemberton's death had been no random act of violence. It was a carefully calculated crime born of hidden grudges and buried resentments. But who had been the mastermind? Who stood to gain the most from his demise? As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, the mist rising around her, she knew that the answers were within reach. It would only be a matter of time before the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, and when it did, the truth would be as undeniable as the fog that had enveloped Little Skelton. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test, continued. The fog had lifted slightly outside the cafe, the heavy mists beginning to give way to the weak light of the afternoon. The conversation between Lydia, Simon, and Miss Marple had reached a boiling point. Lydia's tear-streaked face was a mixture of confusion and betrayal, while Simon Everleigh, though trying to maintain control, couldn't hide the unease in his posture. "You used me," Lydia whispered again, her voice breaking. "You used me to get to Harold, but I didn't kill him, did I? I thought it was over, but then someone else." Miss Marple remained calm, watching the two, her eyes sharp as she assessed the situation. Simon's agitation was palpable, but there was something still hidden in his demeanor, a coldness, a readiness to defend himself even if it meant lying. "You're right," Miss Marple said, her voice smooth but piercing. "You didn't kill him, Miss Harcourt, but you certainly played a part in leading to it." Simon, whose composure had been gradually slipping, stepped forward now, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between Miss Marple and Lydia. "I told you I didn't kill him, but Harold was a threat to everything I'd worked for. I never wanted to hurt him, but then it was too late." Lydia shook her head, her confusion deepening. I don't understand. What do you mean it was too late? What are you saying?" Miss Marple turned her gaze on Simon. "Mr. Everleigh, you didn't kill Harold Pemberton yourself, but you orchestrated the entire thing, didn't you?" The silence that followed was thick, the room seemingly holding its breath. Simon's eyes flicked nervously to the door, then back at Miss Marple. His lips tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Simon said, his voice dropping, the bravado gone. "I was in too deep. I didn't mean for Harold to die, I just wanted him gone. Out of the picture." Miss Marple waited, letting the silence speak for itself. She knew now that Simon was unraveling, that he was revealing more than he intended. Lydia, still confused and shaken, grasped at the edges of Simon's words. "But if you didn't kill him, then who did?" Miss Marple's eyes locked on Simon once more. "You thought you could control everything? Mr. Everly, you thought your association with certain individuals would be enough to remove Harold. But you underestimated the one person who would truly gain from his death." Simon's face blanched, and he took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. His mind was racing, and Miss Marple could see the gears turning in his head as the realization set in. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," Simon muttered, his voice now hoarse. I thought I had it under control, but when I made the call, I didn't realize who I was really dealing with." Miss Marple stood up slowly, the quiet authority in her voice commanding the room. "You brought in someone else. To do the job, someone who would remove Harold permanently. You never thought it would go as far as it did, but it did." Lydia's eyes widened with a sudden understanding. "It was him, wasn't it? It was Arthur Blythe." Simon's expression flickered with surprise, then a deep, dark resignation. He didn't say anything, but the answer was clear in his face. It was as though the truth had finally caught up with him, and he could no longer keep the lie intact. "Blythe?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. "But why? What could he possibly gain from Harold's death?" Miss Marple turned, her gaze toward Lydia, her voice gentle but filled with certainty. Arthur Blythe had been playing a game of his own. He was tied to Harold in ways that most of the village didn't know. But more than that, Blythe had been in a precarious financial situation. Harold had known too much about him. He was a man driven by self-preservation, and when he saw an opportunity to take Harold out of the picture, he took it. Simon's shoulders slumped as he finally spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "Blythe. He had been blackmailing me, trying to get me to cover for his misdeeds. I didn't want to go along with it, but then Harold started digging into my past, into things I didn't want anyone to know. That's when Blythe made his move. He promised me that Harold would be out of the picture if I played along. And I did," Miss Marple continued. "You knew Blythe would go further than you were willing to. But you never expected him to kill Harold. And in your desperation to protect yourself, you fed him the information he needed to carry out the deed." Lydia turned towards Simon, disbelief and hurt in her eyes. You were part of it? You helped him? I never knew." Simon's eyes darted to the side, avoiding her gaze. "I never thought it would come to this. I thought I was just getting rid of an obstacle. I didn't know it would cost him his life." Miss Marple's voice softened as she turned to Lydia. "And you, Miss Harcourt, you were so caught up in your own grief, in your own desperation, that you didn't see how much danger you were in. You didn't know that Simon was already far, deeper than you ever imagined. You were used just like everyone else." Lydia's face crumpled as the weight of the truth hit her. I didn't know," she whispered, her hands trembling. Simon shifted uneasily, his guilt written plainly across his face. "I'm sorry, but it's too late now. The truth's out." Miss Marple turned her gaze on Simon, her expression unyielding. "You see, Mr. Everly, people like you believe they can control the outcome of everything. They think they can make a deal with the devil and get away unscathed. But eventually the truth catches up. And no matter how many secrets you bury, no matter how many people you deceive, there comes a time when it all unravels." Simon's eyes darted to the door again, his mind racing. But Miss Marple's steady presence seemed to anchor him in place. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. Lydia spoke softly. "So, it wasn't me after all. It wasn't about me and Harold. It was always about them, wasn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, her voice a mixture of sympathy and conviction. "It was never about you, Miss Harcourt. You were only one part of a much larger, more dangerous scheme. But now that it's all out in the open, it's time for everyone to face the consequences. Lydia lowered her head, defeated. What now? Now, Miss Marple said, her voice firm. You all have a choice. You can either continue to live in the shadows, hiding from the truth, or you can face what you've done. But I will make sure the truth comes to light. It always does. As the final words left Miss Marple's lips, the door to the cafe swung open once more. This time, it was Constable Harper who entered, his eyes scanning the room. He had been following the investigation from the sidelines, but now he could see that Miss Marple had finally put the pieces together. Miss Marple, I trust you've uncovered everything we need, he asked quietly. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. The time for hiding is over. The truth is out, and it's time for everyone to face the consequences. As the fog outside began to lift, revealing a brighter, clearer sky, Miss Marple knew that the mystery of Harold Pemberton's death had finally come to an end. The secrets that had lingered in Little Skelton for so long had been exposed, and the village would never be the same. But in that moment, Miss Marple stood quietly, knowing that the balance had been restored and that justice, as it always did, had prevailed.